Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for October's edition of Health Bites with Region 3. We are pleased to welcome our speaker, Audrey Tran Lamb. Audrey manages the University of Northern Iowa's Center for Energy and Environmental Education's environmental health initiatives, working where human health and environmental sustainability meet. She oversees two statewide public health education initiatives, Good Neighbor Iowa, focused on elimination of cosmetic herbicide application in public spaces to protect child health, pollinator habitat, and urban water quality, and Farming for Public Health, a program that elevates organic regenerative agriculture as an upstream land-based solution to the cascading environmental health issues stemming from industrial agriculture. In addition, Audrey also facilitates the Pesticides and Public Health Working Group. She holds a master's degree in public health, concentrating in occupational and environmental health from the University of Iowa, and a food systems, the environment, and public health graduate certificate from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Audrey currently serves on the boards of the Heartland Health Research Alliance, the Pesticide Action Network, and the Iowa Rural Health Association. In today's Health Bites, our speaker will give a presentation on farming for public health, thinking upstream. Thank you so much, Audrey, for being our guest speaker this morning, and I will turn everything over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is one of my favorite topics to speak on. I apologize in advance if I start to ramble, but please, please, please do put your questions, your comments in the chat so we can talk about them towards the end. My goal is to get through this to make sure we have ample time to discuss some of the content. But like I said, this is something that I get really excited about. And so I might need Margie to give me a hand when I need to get off the stage here. So let me progress here. So like Margie said, my background is in public health. And prior to that, I was in energy conservation, but it was my time working on a small urban farm that I really start to put the pieces together about how land use, farming, public health, nutrition, energy, climate all came together. And so I thought public health was the field for me. Public health is a preventative field, right? We're systems thinkers, we're trained to be so. And we're trained and taught to prioritize upstream solutions, which means that we're much more likely to find the solution that turns off the faucet instead of the more acute solution that might mean us mopping up the floor. I'd much prefer to turn off the tap than to mop up the floor. That's what the theme of this presentation is going to be about today. The theme of Farming for Public Health is to really seek out those upstream land-based solutions that solves for these cascading environmental health impacts that ultimately impact humans. So the objectives of this presentation today is really to describe and articulate the connection between farming, land use, and human health, explore how agriculture in the Midwest and public health relate, and to share land-based solutions that address environmental and human health outcomes, those negative outcomes, I should say. Now, this is probably a familiar sight to some of your region states. This is definitely a familiar, nostalgic, homey picture for me. This was taken, I think, a couple falls ago when I was returning from a conference out of state. This is what Iowa looks like. This is what the Midwest looks like. A different way to look at this, probably less beautiful to some of you, is this cross-section of a county in Iowa. Now, I am from Iowa, so a lot of my examples will be coming from our state, but it's what I'm talking about is very applicable across the Midwest, across the Corn Belt, and highly agricultural states. Now, we can see that this picture seems pretty colorful, right? Until you look at the legend and you start to see some repeating words here. Most of this is corn and soy. We have some yellow dots here that show that only corn is planted on these acres. Majority corn is that maybe this land, this peachy land, would get a break from corn every 5 to 6 years. Maybe something else would be planted there. Maybe it would be a pasture, maybe it would be soy. And then you have the dark orange and the green being a corn-soy rotation. I've heard some farmers call it an alternation, not a rotation, because you're bopping back and forth between two things and not really rotating amongst different crops. But really, we have a cross-section here of Wright County that is just basically corn and soybeans. And this is a little bit dated now. This is a survey from 2010 to 2016, but I can assure you that this map has not changed very much. Maps like these do change based on the market prices of different crops. So if the price of corn is high, maybe more corn will be planted, vice versa if soy is dominating the market. Maps like these, they put very little emphasis on soil or ecosystem health and other externalities because it is dictated by the price of these commodities. And just for some background information, Iowa is, you probably guessed from this map, really dominated by these two crops. This is all just background information for what I'll be sharing in a little bit. Corn, where does it go from Iowa? This is a little dated now, and so I've updated some of these numbers. Most of the corn grown in Iowa, almost 60% of it, goes to ethanol and fuel. Another third will go to animal feed, but because these numbers are a little outdated, I can't tell you exactly what percent of that feed goes to what animal. And then approximately 10% of the corn grown in Iowa goes to other industrial purposes, exports, and then there's some residual left over, right? But there's quite a large breakdown here, and none of it seems to be going to, really none of it seems to be going to human consumption. A lot of it is used for food, for animals, and a lot of it's used for fuel. Okay. More terminology to define really quickly here. It's important to think about what this term means, like a leaky crop, because this will come into play with some of our downstream human health impacts. But we call corn bean rotation or corn on corn, continuous corn, a leaky crop. And that's because corn doesn't really hold soil or nutrients very well. It's got a very shallow root system, and the soil is left bare in corn rotations for much of the year, leaving the soil pretty vulnerable. It's also an annual plant. Of course, it's planted every spring, which means that it's very nitrogen hungry. So it requires a lot of nitrogen, either from natural sources or synthetic nitrogen, to make the crop healthy. This differs from soy a little bit. Soy is a nitrogen fixing plant. It's got a little bit deeper root systems, but these plants actually pump nitrogen back into the soil. It's a legume. All legumes are known to do this. Just so you have a little bit of botany incorporated into this presentation, so you sort of know what it is that we're talking about here. I love to show this map to our students. I always quiz them on what this is. Some of you will be familiar. This is a map of Iowa's watersheds. They come in different sizes. They come bigger and smaller. But the way we can think about watersheds, and why it's important to think about watersheds when we're talking about land use and how it impacts human health, is because this will dictate the direction that water flows. So being aware not only of how the land is used, but the direction that water that runs across that land goes is really important in thinking about the literal downstream impacts. Watersheds, a great way to think about them are bowls. They're really just when water falls, where it will be going and what direction it will flow. And I'll show some more pictures here that might make that a little bit more clear. Okay, so we have concluded the background portion of the presentation, and we're going to get into the meat of things now. So farming for public health, one of the most obvious ways that public health intersects with farming and land use is issues of water quality, right? Fertilizers make things grow, and it's an indiscriminate growth promoter. So not only will it help corn and other farm crops grow, commodity crops grow, but it'll also help things like algae grow in waterways. The Gulf of Mexico hypoxic zone is an example of growth out of control and how it's harmful. And I'm realizing now it's pretty shameful that I don't have this citation listed in my slide here, but this is a study done out of the University of Iowa's Hydrologic Research Center that showed that the state averaged about 45% of the nitrogen levels going into the upper Mississippi, so the river on this side of Iowa, and then 55% of the nitrogen going into the Missouri River Basin on this side of Iowa. And overall, what this meant was that Iowa's nitrogen or nutrient use on its farm fields was contributing to about 30% of the hypoxic zone in the Mississippi Delta, which is quite astronomical. 30% of all of the Mississippi River Basin, which is this large portion here, I'll show a better picture in the next slide, is being contributed by one little state. It's quite amazing. So not only are there issues of fish kills, which can have impacts in for the economics of a region, it can also impact quality of life, recreation outcomes for the people living in this area. Here's a better picture of that Mississippi River Basin, right? So when we think downstream and we think land use, it's quite impactful when you see photos like this. Okay, now the animations on the slide didn't work exactly how I wanted them to, but nitrates in Iowa have been a problem, and this is like the second way that water quality impacts human health. Let me move forward here. So the EPA has set contaminant levels, maximum contaminant levels for nitrates at 10 parts per million. And this is an acute threshold. So when we have high levels of nitrate, 10 or more ppm, we start to notice acute health impacts for vulnerable populations, specifically babies. Methemoglobinemia is an outcome here where if babies who are formula fed water mixed with water containing high levels of nitrates, they can their blood doesn't bind to oxygen very well because it's caught up with the nitrates. So we can have children actually they start to turn blue, they start to suffocate because they're not able to get oxygen to their bodies. We're mostly concerned about high levels of nitrate coming from synthetic nitrogen off of these farm fields in private wells, because the Safe Drinking Water Act applies to cities, municipalities serving 25 households or more. Private wells are not protected by the Safe Drinking Water Act, so it's not something that's an enforceable level. 10 parts per million is not an enforceable level in these areas, making people who have private wells particularly vulnerable to high levels of nitrates, but also other things like bacteria, pesticides like atrazine, arsenic, etc., things that are typically monitored for in a public drinking water system. There are some pretty severe impacts for the cost for nitrates, I should say. First of all, being the cost, like who pays to remediate downstream nitrogen in drinking water? Typically, it would be a city, a municipality that would have to build a water treatment plant. And these water treatment plants are extremely expensive. So there is an issue of equity, an issue of justice with this urban and rural divide when it comes to water quality and how farming impacts that. I would say I want to point to this really amazing publication by the Union of Concerned Scientists talking about turning soils into sponges, which really highlights the relationship that healthy soil has to preventing these downstream impacts, including the water quality from a recreational or economic point of view, but also a human health point of view, how protecting soils really does protect human health. And protecting soils in Iowa is a little bit difficult when you have bare soils for very vulnerable parts of the year, right in the spring when we're receiving the most rains, and there's not the plant cover to protect those soils. Soils in Iowa or in the Midwest that are that only have corn, these annuals with shallow root systems that need to have a lot of synthetic nitrogen to keep them healthy, don't have a very good water holding capacity. And so a lot of the water tends to run right off of it, causing sheet and rill erosion episodes. Nitrogen is very, very water soluble, which sort of makes sense because we see it in drinking water, we see it in private wells and subsurface flows, but phosphorus actually binds to soil. So when we lose soil, and the Midwest is known for having incredibly rich, fertile soils, which makes farming a no-brainer here, we also lose a lot of those phosphorus particles, which can also contribute to eutrophication of streams and rivers downstream of the farms. Okay, so that was a little bit about water quality. I want to move on to water quantity now, because that has also very severe impacts to public health. Again, I will reference that soils into sponges publication from the Union of Concerned Scientists, being an amazing companion piece to this presentation, actually, as it outlines the ways in which protecting soil and making sure that it has that high water holding capacity, has that high organic matter content, can really mitigate some of the downstream flooding that we see in the Midwest. All of these photos were taken in 2019 during the flooding on the Mississippi River, which you can see here on the right hand of the screen, and the Missouri River on the left hand screen. This is Dubuque and Davenport here, and these are pictures from the Pacific Junction area along the Missouri River. Immediately, things that come to mind here are, the irony of this top photo here. It takes a little bit to describe the irony, but it's also really important. So I'm going to try to take the time to do it. So this was a brand new gas station in the Pacific Junction area in Iowa. And when this flood rolled through, excuse me, it left a bunch of corn residue from the sort of upstream farms that just sort of brought it in and landed it here. Most gas pumps in Iowa, probably across the nation, are cut with a certain percentage of ethanol, right? Which, like I showed in the earlier part of the presentation, comes from corn that we grow here in the Midwest, right? About 60% of the corn that we grow here goes to ethanol. So we're seeing that maybe with lowered prices at the gas pump, there is very obvious in this photo externality of downstream impacts of that much corn production in the state, that massive change in land use to accommodate for corn. And we're seeing it sort of play out in downstream floods and in disaster recovery across the state. We do have, I'll point this out a little bit later too, but differences in a city or town's ability to mitigate, be resilient against, and bounce back from a flood. And there's also, of course, all of the water quality issues. I know we're talking about water quantity here, but water quality issues of when an entire town gets flooded, when waters get into basements and garages, into landfills. You can actually see here in this photo sort of that rainbow flare of oil slick that's also now in the waterways, impacting downstream public health, of course. So then another obvious, very major component of disaster, being hit by a disaster, is the disaster recovery. What are the public health implications of this, right? The mental health impacts of having to evacuate your home multiple times, as I have been, to prepare for rising floodwaters, or to have to leave your home. What does this mean for disease spread when we have all of this sort of the sewers backed up, depending on the sewer system of the town or municipality? What does this mean for access to care? I don't know a lot of, say, hospitals, clinics, dialysis clinics that have boat parking. So we're going to have a problem with, of course, access to care, maybe ability to store medication if electricity is out after events like this. Excuse me. And then if a person is able to move back into their home after the floodwaters have receded, what is the indoor air quality going to be like? Is the home safe to live in? Are there other opportunities for this homeowner or this family to go other places? It might not be. They might just have to live with the consequences of having a home that was flooded, as many homes in Cedar Rapids did actually during the floods of 2008. I do want to point out some very important pieces of justice here and injustice. This is a photo that I really love to show of Cedar Rapids preparing for a flood. This was also in 2019, the same year that I showed sort of both coasts of Iowa being flooded, the Dubuque, Davenport, and the Pacific Junction area. Cedar Rapids, at this point in our flooding history, we've kind of got this figured out. When we know that the flood waters are rising, the HESCO barriers come out, the citizens of Cedar Rapids start to sandbag their own homes, roads close. There's sort of an order about it. We know what to do when a flood is coming because we have the resources to do it. Pacific Junction, unfortunately, did not. A lot of other small towns along these rivers do not have the opportunity to protect themselves against the downstream impacts of how it is that we've been treating our land, of land use changes, and the rising impacts of climate change. So I think it's a really important piece to think about here too is that there are disproportionate impacts here, even in the Midwest. We typically see very exaggerated impacts. And exaggerated is an inappropriate word to use because I think that these impacts are going to become the norm. But these impacts of climate change impacting faraway places along the coast, being hit by hurricanes or these freak floods. But this is happening very, very close to home within our region. Okay. Another aspect of land use, farming, and public health is that of pesticides. Pesticides, I want to really quickly disambiguate. It's actually an umbrella term. I think this confuses a lot of people. Pesticides is an umbrella term, which can include insecticides, herbicides, rodenticides, fungicides, and biocides. Because in addition to cockroaches or termites, dandelions, rats, molds, germs even can all be considered pests. So when someone is referring to a pesticide, without context, it could refer to any of these chemical classes. Now, every one of these types of pesticides, so taking insecticides, for example, has different classes of chemicals. So an organochlorine, an organophosphate, carbamate, a pyrethroid, a neonicotinoid. These are all examples of different insecticides with different mechanisms of action, meaning each class will affect a pest in a certain way. Okay, just a little bit of background because I've noticed in some of my presentations, the term pesticide can be confusing. Anyway, there are a lot of pesticides used in Iowa, necessarily based on how many acres of corn and soybeans that we plant. The thing is that, though, we have not done any studies, the EPA has not done any studies, there haven't been really many independent studies done on the combination or synergistic effects of so many different pesticides and the volume of pesticides being applied to our land, and how that might have impacts to human or ecological health. The EPA does not evaluate pesticides for their impacts on human health. They are evaluating the product to see whether or not the label is written, I should say, I'll put this a different way. The EPA evaluates a chemical to make sure that it does what the label says it's going to do. Human health isn't really a factor in this, like it is with an FDA approval process for a pharmaceutical, for example. Now, we do know that there's very strong, robust body of evidence that shows that there are harm to children, especially and other vulnerable individuals when it comes to developmental impacts and pesticide exposure, and especially when it comes to endocrine disruption, I should say. There are, of course, occupational harms that we need to be aware of in a farm setting. The people who are mixing and applying the chemicals are sort of the first line of exposure. And of course, there are harms to pollinators. Many of these pesticides are designed to eliminate biodiversity, either through weeds or through insects. And so we, as humans, really can't pull ourselves out of the ecosystem. We are a part of this entire system. And so when there is harm to pollinators, there will be a ripple effect that meets human health. And so that's something that we consider too when we think about our work in farming for public health. Okay. And this was sort of the body of evidence that I was referring to when I was talking about the harm to children. And I really like to highlight endocrine disruption and endocrine disrupting chemicals through personal care products, chemicals in the environment, plastics, but especially pesticides as an emerging public health threat that sort of our field needs to clue in on, because we will see a lot more of this in literature and in conferences as time moves on. Okay. Unfortunately, the National Agricultural Statistics Services are a little bit slow on releasing their chemical reports. So these numbers are from 2018. I'm sharing this just to give you a sense of the volume of pesticides used in Iowa, and of course, then more broadly across the US. About 32 million pounds of herbicide is used on corn every year. This is not including insecticides, this is not including fungicides, and about the same amount is used on soybeans, 21.5 million pounds. I think a really important thing to note here too, I pulled out one insecticide in particular that was used in 2018, chlorpyrifos, which has very, very recently been pulled from all food tolerances in the United States because it has been for an extremely long time linked to extreme neurodevelopmental, neurobehavioral harms in children. We are still sort of permitted to use chlorpyrifos in crops that we are shipping internationally, which I like to highlight is another obvious injustice issue and a huge public health harm. Okay, going back to children very, very briefly. I know we're probably all aware of this, but I shouldn't assume it's not a good thing, so I'm going to run through this slide anyway. Children are especially vulnerable to chemical threats in their environment, and living in a rural agricultural state, pesticides would be at the top of that list. Children are vulnerable physically, physiologically, behaviorally, sort of they do things and they behave in a way that puts them at higher risk of exposure than, say, an adult. You know, they eat more and breathe more I should separate this out. They eat and drink more per pound of body weight than an adult. Their hearts beat faster on average than an adult, and they breathe more quickly. So there's an inhalation exposure potential. There's a higher ingestion exposure, and they sort of crawl around on the ground. They put things in their mouth to explore the world, right? Things that may be contaminated with, things that an adult would necessarily avoid because our behaviors have changed as we have aged. Now, when we think about children's exposure to these chemicals, dose is quite important because it would take less of a compound to cause harm to a child based on how they're able to metabolize the compound, et cetera, et cetera. But so is time of exposure. And this is a really key point when it comes to kids. Children are really literally hurtling through developmental stages. And each one of these stages sort of is predicated on the previous developmental stage. So if we are compromised as we are developing, it sort of impacts the stepping stones that we're able to achieve throughout our life course. So early life exposure to certain compounds can have long-term effects across the life course. Now, pesticides have been linked very strongly, like I mentioned earlier, to neurobehavioral issues. This can include autism, it can include ADHD, learning delays in certain cases, and there have been shown sex differences. So boys and girls will show different outcomes with pesticide exposure, for example. It's very, very interesting. Childhood cancers have been linked to pesticides, and I should also say agricultural chemicals, mostly soft tissue sarcomas, other brain tumors. The pesticide exposure in utero has been linked to birth defects, other endocrine and reproductive harms. And asthma in the literature has been pointed to pesticides either acting as a trigger or plays a role in the development of, the development of the disease. There's a lot here, and it's very difficult to cite individual studies because there is a body of evidence. This would be quite a long bibliography that I'd be happy to provide in a follow-up, since I don't have it shamefully on my PowerPoint presentation. The other thing that we are very concerned about from both an economic point of view, which impacts rural economic vitality and rural public health, but also direct human health exposure, is drift incidents. We've had increasing number of drift instances being reported in the Midwest due to the use of dicamba on dicamba-ready crops. This is something that is extremely interesting to those of us who are agricultural nerds, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. I do want to note, though, that agricultural drift incidences is likely very, very underreported, just based on the system of drift reporting that we have here in Iowa and the process that farmers and others have to go through in order to report that. Okay, but I want to make sure that we get to some good news and talk about solutions, because that's what I promised at the beginning of my presentation in the objective section. So there have been some amazing studies, some amazing work done out of our land-grant university with some researchers, especially that of recently retired Dr. Matt Liebman, who asked some very important questions about land use and how it impacts downstream communities. Some very important questions here before we move into their findings. These researchers set out to ask, can diversifying corn and soybean systems with small grains and forage crops reduce the requirements for purchase inputs, things like synthetic nitrogen and pesticides? Can it maintain or improve productivity and profitability? You know, if farmers make these changes, are they going to go bankrupt? Is it going to be too hard for them to do? We wanted to find out. Will they be able to suppress weeds effectively? Are we going to be able to reduce susceptibility to disease? And would we improve environmental performance characteristics? Things like more pollinators, more biodiversity of other species, things like that. So these researchers were interested in if changing how the land looks and what it is that we plant on the land, would these things change and how would they change? And just so you have a picture, if you're not familiar with agriculture, this might not be very intuitive for you, but what it means to increase a rotation is to add crops to a field. So currently, if you remember way back to that Wright County, Iowa cross-section, we had corn and soybean rotation. In a 2-year crop rotation, the second year would simply be the soy being planted where the corn was, right? And so that's what a rotation year. Every 2 years, the crops go back to where they were. Every year they switch. A 3-year rotation would look maybe like corn, soy, and alfalfa. And then the next year, the field would look like soy, alfalfa, corn, and so on and so forth. 4-year rotation, you're simply adding more biodiversity. Corn, soy, alfalfa, and oats. Soy, alfalfa, oats, and corn, right? And so it would take 4 years for this rotation to be completed, 3 years for this one, and 2 years for this one. Just a little bit more ag background. You'll all be ag experts by the end of this presentation. So what they found in their study is that for yields, they wanted to see if yields were impacted. The 2-year rotation is shown here, 3-year rotation and 4-year rotation. No impact on yields. In fact, there was a small increase, and there are several reasons why this could be that if we have time, we can discuss towards the end. Annual fertilizer applied, and we're looking at nitrogen again. So looking at that, what has it been attributed to and what we know is attributed to blue baby syndrome, that in a 2-year rotation, a 3-year rotation and a 4-year rotation compared to the 2-year rotation, we have significant decreases in nitrogen application. This slide takes my breath away. Their findings here is absolutely incredible. Simply by growing more biodiversity, increasing the crop rotation in a field, you can have significant impacts on the chemicals applied and what that would mean for downstream communities. It's incredible. It's so amazing. The same was found for herbicides, simply because if you applied herbicides to a field of oats or a field of alfalfa, like they were testing in this study, you would kill the crop because there aren't GMO alfalfa and GMO oats. So a significant reduction in herbicides applied. And then looking at profitability, the 2-year rotation compared to the 3 and 4, there was not a decrease in profitability. In fact, because of the diversified portfolio of these fields, they could diversify their markets, which is amazing. This is great. Okay, so to summarize really quickly here, these researchers found that a diverse crop rotation, so that 3 and 4-year crop rotation compared to the 2, featured higher yields, less herbicides and fewer herbicides, less synthetic nitrogen applied, and half the amount of fossil fuel energy, as well as improved soil quality, which would help with those downstream flooding impacts. And the reason why this piece here, this 4th bullet point here is so important is that, you know, climate change is the greatest threat to global public health. You know, I've shown pictures of the floods here in Iowa. You know, we've been hit by 3 derechos in 3 years. The effects of the changing climate is becoming more and more obvious. And so I think as we consider how agriculture plugs into public health, we really can't discount the impacts that agriculture has on climate. Some really incredible research is coming out of the University of Minnesota and with some of our research colleagues at the the Iowa State University. I really just encourage you all to just look up this article and read the abstract. Fossil energy consumption was shown to be reduced by about half in these 3 and 4 year rotations compared to that second year rotation. And not only does it reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but the human health damages in dollars was reduced because of the associated particulate matter associated with greenhouse gas emissions. So I have some other graphs that I will show really quickly because I just think this is so amazing. And I don't think I have time to really go in depth here. Basically, the researchers suggest that strategies to reduce fossil fuels and reduce particulate matter is to diversify cropping systems. Right, the greatest consumer of fossil fuels was the corn and soybean rotation, much of which Iowa is currently in now. Okay, this is being repetitive, but we're decreasing the fossil fuel usage by more than half here. It's just completely incredible. These are the graphs that I think are very, very impactful that I wanted to share here. The 2-year crop rotation, conventional and low simply refers to herbicide treatment. So in the conventional system, they used what they typically would in corn and soy field. Low means that they were using a little bit less. These are not organic systems, which I think is even more amazing. But we can see a significant decrease in the greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions based on how many years, what biodiversity is on the land. Most of this, these greenhouse gases comes from nitrogen fertilizer production, since synthetic nitrogen is produced by the Haber-Bosch process, which is responsible for using anywhere from 3 to 5% of all natural gas globally. This is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. Totally incredible. Last piece of research that I wanted to share with you all in terms of solutions and exciting things so that we don't leave the presentation feeling hopeless, we feel very hopeful, is more work from Iowa State University, that of Dr. Matt Helmers, who has been working on looking at prairie strips incorporated into agricultural fields to see sort of what downstream impacts that we have. And I think that visually the results speak for themselves. Looking at edge of field practices, and I'm going to go back one slide here. You can see sort of how their test fields are set up. They're set up like a little watershed, a little bowl with a spout. So they were able to capture what was happening at the edge of these fields. In 100, in a field with 100% crop, no prairie, no perennial strips, this is what you were seeing after a rain event, a 4-inch rain event. So pretty heavy rain. Lots of soil loss, a lot of water loss. Remember, with soil loss comes phosphorus loss, and with water loss comes nitrogen loss if a field is supplemented heavily with synthetic fertilizers. With only 10% of a field being in perennials and 90% of it being crop, we see a significant decrease in the amount of soil that's lost, which is absolutely amazing. And then in the perennial fields, we don't see any soil lost. And that's because of these really, really deep root systems that perennial plants will develop over time. These root systems hold soil, they hold water, they increase organic matter, which increases the porosity and the water holding capacity of soil. Just really, really incredible research and very, very practical. Dr. Matt Helmers looked at all of these metrics of biodiversity to see how these ecosystem services were improved by changing edge of field practices or by planting these prairie strips in fields, and found that insect richness, pollinator abundance, bird species all improved, while the runoff, which contributes to flooding, was reduced by almost 40%. They retained amazing amounts of soil, which is fantastic since it's one of Iowa's greatest. I really shouldn't discriminate just to Iowa. All of the Midwest has incredible soil. And so holding onto that soil is an incredible resource for the states. And then phosphorus retention, about 4-fold. Totally amazing. And this is just 10% of fields being planted in native plants. Now, just to wrap us up here, I want to share exactly what it is that my work is doing to promote some of this information. So my role really is to highlight what these upstream solutions can do for downstream public health impacts. And I am particularly targeting a public health audience for this information, since there is a lot that we can do in the realm of policy and the realm of education to impact populations and not just individuals. This is a photo of me at a conference with Dr. Matt Liebman, Dr. David Swartney, and Dr. Ron Roseman, who is actually a farmer. He's been farming farming organically and regeneratively, I should say, for almost 40 years now. And he came to the Public Health Conference of Iowa back in 2018 to share his farming practices, to show that it is possible, practical, profitable. And we all just came to share with our public health audience how this does contribute to a healthier community, a healthier Iowa. We also host field days to support peer-to-peer farmer learning, so that when there is a farmer who is putting some of these regenerative organic practices into place, they can share their knowledge and information with other farmers in the area. But these are also settings in which we invite public health professionals to get onto the field and to be there to support these farmers. I really think showing up for our allied health professionals, which farmers absolutely are, we can really highlight to them the role that they're playing in improving community health. Public health is not just the work that we do at the county level, right, or at the hospital, or in these very traditional public health settings. Public health is a team sport. And so I think that showing up for these farmers who are putting these amazing practices into place is so important to our overall mission in highlighting the role that land has to overall public health. Okay. That's where I'm going to stop for now. I want to make sure that there is time for questions, discussions, if there are any. Like I said at the top, I'm very, very passionate about all of this, and so I can easily see myself talking for another 45 minutes. So I'm going to stop it here and pause for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Is really fascinating. But we do have a question in the chat, and then I know we'll have some others. So the first question that we have is it practical now to let fields lie fallow or to plant legumes to improve soil? So the comment goes on to say that a fallow field could be rented out to running someone's cattle if they planted grass. So.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, thank you for asking it. So it's really interesting in some of these longer rotations, and I'm going to actually go back a couple slides. Ron Roseman here, he farms in Shelby County, Iowa. He has a 7-year crop rotation, which does include forage for his animals and letting sort of the fields rest. So on the years that he's sort of doing that, it's a mix of clovers, legumes, radishes, sunflowers, peas, field peas. It's a very, very biodiverse mix, which helps break up the soil where it could be compacted and also helps return nutrients into the ground. One of those being nitrogen, because of all the legumes that are sort of in that cropping mix. And then, as animals are allowed to forage on that, they're also leaving nutrients back into the ground, stomping that in, incorporating things. So yes, it is very, very practical. I would say, though, that because we are in a very 2-year crop rotation mindset, we think about economic returns on an annual basis instead of a systems basis. So if you have a 4-year, 5-year, 3-year crop rotation, the annual accounting model doesn't really work because you're building in all of these externalities, these positive externalities into your system that you won't see a return for or return from in that same year. So leaving that field fallow, if you don't have animals, might seem like you're not making any money from it. But the nutrients that are being laid into the ground, the increased organic matter and soil holding or water holding capacity, is going to pay off in years later. It's going to pay off in, having a field that is resistant to drought later because there's more moisture in the soil because of how you've cared for it. It might mean reduced flooding downstream later. It might mean that your crop is more resistant to disease because of the biodiversity that you've engineered into your system. So it is practical, but if we expand our mindset to do our accounting on a system, on a full rotation basis. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but that's a really, really excellent question.
Thanks. So we have another question, kind of a follow-up. Do you work on oak wilt decline?
No, actually, I don't, and I'm not quite sure what that is. My mind immediately goes to issues of dicamba drift, but I don't want to assume that I know what the question is getting at. I apologize.
Okay, so I have a question for you. So, how are you doing in terms of getting buy-in from the farmers, the people that are actually in the field doing the work?
Yes. Oh, okay. Another great question. So right now I'm actually in the middle of teaching a seminar course about the food, farming, and public health system in Iowa. And for the first half of the semester, we really lay out the ways in which the system, sort of the farm system, the subsidies, the farm bill, the market that's dominated by corn and soy, how that really puts farmers in a very tough situation, a very risky situation to change how it is that they're farming. There are certainly some farmers and groups of farmers who are very, very passionate about breaking out of the current system and working against the barriers that are very clearly laid out against them. So this isn't something that I would say, I didn't mean to paint the picture that, oh, super easy, we'll just transition all of this land into something new. No, there's lots of barriers out there, but farmers are in a very, very tricky and precarious situation just because of the system that is laid out in front of them. So the buy-in from farmers who are receptive is wonderful. It totally makes sense to them. They are engineers, they're chemists, they understand how the land works, they're very tuned in with nature, and they understand the reasons why you would want to farm sort of differently than the current system dictates. But they're being practical about what it means to actually do that, and it can be difficult. I hope that answered your question, Margie.
Oh, it does, absolutely.
Okay, yes.
So here's another question. What are your thoughts on advocating for government subsidies on other foods or plants aside from corn and wheat, et cetera, so we can further promote crop diversification across the U.S.?
Okay, that is another really good question. There does need to be some kind of intervention for these large scale transitions to work. So, at the county level, and I think at certain things at the state level, you can get subsidies or cost shares to put into practice just different farming practices. For example, there's cost share for cover crops, which would be really important in this transition in soil health and to improve biodiversity. I'm not an expert in subsidies, and all I can sort of think about is that subsidies for corn has sort of transformed the landscape to look the way it does currently in the Midwest, which is not necessarily amazing for public health, right? But I am nervous. So there needs to be some intervention to change the landscape. Yes, I don't know what that needs to look like to increase biodiversity, and I am nervous to lay out, suggest anything, because I wouldn't want subsidies to be the problem why things got worse, but there does need to be some kind of intervention, and I think it probably does have to be monetary.
Thanks. Yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah. Here's another question. Someone just recently heard about a new company called Perennial Pantry. And the question is, could you talk a little bit more about Kernza and perennial wheat?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. Okay, so my understanding and my just overall knowledge about Kernza is a little bit limited, but I know that it is a perennial wheat variety that a lot of work by the Land Institute has been done to sort of cultivate. Basically, it's like wheat, right? But it's not planted annually. So an annual wheat would be something that you plant in the spring, like how we do with corn and soybeans. You plant it once, you harvest it, and it comes out of the ground. You till up the ground, and that's it. You do it again next year. With Kernza and other perennial plants, you plant it once and it stays in the ground for several years. I think that there is you do need to pull it out of the ground and replant. I think there's the period of time, and I'm not exactly sure when that is. But it has all of these amazing soil protective qualities that other perennial plants would have. Like I showed those really, really deep root systems. Kernza would sort of have that, which, like I said, is really important for water infiltration, for soil health, increasing soil porosity, increasing water holding capacity, increasing that organic matter, which has all of these downstream positive impacts for the farm itself by keeping the nutrients on there. And Kernza is something that people can eat. Right now, corn grown in the Midwest, soy that's grown in the Midwest, very, very little of the soy grown in the Midwest, well, I said that backwards. None of the corn that we grow in the Midwest, people can eat. Some of the corn, the soy that's grown in the Midwest, people can eat. Kernza, oats, other small grains. That's small grains that we can work into our rotation, extend the rotation that people can actually eat. So there's a lot of really good things about moving in the direction of small grains, but really amazing things that can come from growing things that are perennial. And we're starting to get into the permaculture or the agroecology piece of this presentation, which I didn't talk too much about, but good question. I wish I could talk more coherently about it and sort of work through my excitement about it.
Well, we'll have to have you come back and
Yes.
do a follow-up. So we do have a little bit of information about the oak question. So oak trees have a fungus and they are dying via the roots, especially in central Texas, and it seems to be spreading near Houston. So yeah, and then somebody dropped into the chat that Texas A&M Forest Service has a really good clearinghouse site on oak wilt. So
okay,
if you're interested in that. And I know, I mean, across Kansas, we have pine blight and et cetera. So lots of things going on out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of different sort of, as it relates to agriculture, pathogens that impact commodity crops here in the Midwest, which we use a lot of fertilizer to combat. There's another tie to public health that I didn't really talk about at all, but I've only recently learned about through my cohort experience with NIAMRI, which is the National Institute for Antimicrobial Resistance Research and Education, which is that, there are pathogens that can live on soil, in soil and on plants that can become resistant to fertilizer, that can become resistant to fungicide application. And so there is a little bit of a worry about overuse of fungicides in an agricultural setting can bleed over into the human health arena through developing resistant pathogens. So I know we were talking about oaks and we were talking about wilt and fungus there, but it jogged my memory about fungal pathogens that exist in soy and corn that also, in the future have the potential to become a really significant public health problem if we're not careful with the use of our tools that we have in our tool belt, that of being fungicides, which are medically important as well.
Well, thank you. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I guess we'll go ahead and conclude that. So I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And if you do have any more questions for Audrey, go ahead and put them in the chat. If not, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the housekeeping details at the end here. And we do look forward to seeing you next month for Health Bites in November. And I want to thank Audrey so much for sharing your expertise with us. It was really fascinating. And I know all of us learned quite a bit about the farming practices that are going on in the Midwest and in our states, and truly appreciate your presentation.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.